I started a series last week, and you'll notice that there's no outline in your program. I think this is the first time in about 7 years or so that I've not put an outline in the program. I know, wow. And I had reason for that, but I'm not going to go into it this morning. It doesn't have to do with like having way too much fun this week. It has to do with last-minute changes. I came upon this theme in my heart and decided that for the month of July we would be talking about self-examination. And as you are aware, if you've been attending Open Door, the last couple of series that I've been talking about has been with the intent of enabling us to live the kingdom out in the world, and not only among us within these four walls, but also so that people outside this building and outside our church functions will see a glimpse of God and be attracted to God. That is a summation of the last two series that I've talked about. So beginning last week and for the next 4 weeks, we're talking about, or the next 3 weeks, we're talking about examining ourselves to see how we align with this concept of portraying Christ to the world around us. And as we are well aware of that there are things that we do and things that we think and things that we say that without self-examination may not totally be reflecting what we want to reflect, and especially in our faith. This doesn't only apply to our faith, but it certainly does apply to our faith. So I know that I was born in church, practically. My mother told me that the first Sunday that I was alive on the planet, and I don't know what day of the week I was born, but the first Sunday I was in church. And I was in church, I think my cradle rolls. Are you old enough to know what a cradle roll is? Anybody? Serious? Do you know what a cradle roll is? Oh my gosh. Linda, you must know what a cradle roll is. Okay, Linda. I don't mean to point you out as being as old as I am. I'm sorry. A cradle roll is when you were in nursery in church, they would take attendance, and you would get a little certificate at the end of the year if you had perfect attendance. So it was like a cradle roll attendance. And I don't know how long it was that I went for Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. Of course, I was being carried to church. I was still being nursed. I was still nursing, something like that. So anyway, I wasn't there of my own volition, of course, but I was brought to church and I was raised in church, and it never stopped. It never stopped. The point is that sometimes we get so immersed in the community of a group of people, whether it's the church or another, that we stop thinking critically about what it is we stand for and what we personify in our commitment. So thus this series about being about examining ourselves, our thoughts, and our intentions to be assured that we are living out what we intend to live out. Now, what we intend to live out needs to be based on Scripture that tells us that we should reflect. We who are created in the image of God should reflect the goodness of God and the love of God. And so often we hear of people who are outside the four walls of the church or not a part of any particular church community. They give us very good reasons for that. Things like, the church people are mean to me. They're critical of me. They judge me. They expect me to live a certain way and be a certain way. And when I'm not that way, then they judge me and they criticize me. And so the idea of really coming to grips with who we are in our faith and what does that look like to other people is what this series is about. And I have as a subtitle, Letting People In versus Keeping People Out. Now, as I was raised in my young life, I remember as a preteen and a teenager hearing things in our Protestant church that Catholics weren't Christian. I'm just giving this as an example. That I remember hearing my sister, and at this time I was a young teenager, and my sister, who was a couple of years older than me, was asking our pastor after a message that he preached that was basically condemning about everybody who wasn't our particular denomination, our flavor of faith. And so he made this statement in this message pretty much that made my sister question whether Catholics could be Christian or not, and she asked him that question, and she said, well, what about nuns? They're such chaste people, and they're good people, and they commit commit themselves to this relationship with Christ that is far away and above a lot of Protestants in what we do. And he basically communicated the idea and the thought that if you are not this, and if you are not this, and if you worship Mary too much, you're not even going to be in heaven. And we've come a ways, thank God, in our world to realize that the Christian world, which, by the way, is almost 1/3 of the 7 billion people that are on the planet, the Christianity is the largest religion that is in existence today on the planet. 2.5 billion people approximately compared to 7 billion people that are on the planet. And then there are 3 other major religions that fall under that. But so often we not only condemn other religions, but we condemn people within the broad scope of Christianity because they're Catholic instead of Protestant, or because they're Orthodox instead of what we are. And my thought today is about opening the doors, which is, again, the name of our church, to people, regardless of what their faith is, and let them see the reflection of who Jesus has enabled us to become. When people see us as judgmental and angry and irrelevant, they want nothing to do with Christianity because they've lumped you with Christianity when you wear that label. So that's why we're examining ourselves to see if the fruit of our life is truly the life that Jesus reflected in his life that was attracting people to this good news of the gospel. So, through our lens, what is our lens? How we view people who believe differently than we do will affect our attitude towards them and our treatment of them. Let that sink in for a moment. The way we view the world, and especially the way we view the world of people who believe very different from us, is going to affect our attitude toward them and our treatment of them. And you may feel like you do a pretty good job, but very often there are subtleties that come through in communication, verbal and nonverbal, that causes a person who is outside our scope of belief to be repelled from us. And how in the world are we ever going to communicate the truth of who God is when we're repelling the people who we want to reach? I want to talk a little bit about a history. This is a story about young Christian faith in the first century. This is a statue of Paul the Apostle. Philippians 3 talks and describes Paul, and he is talking about his own experience. He was circumcised on the 8th day, which was a Jewish custom that was required, especially if you were following the religious requirements of Judaism. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, which was one of the tribes, and a favored tribe. Benjamin and his brother Joseph were favored in the family, and Benjamin was considered a special tribe. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. He stood out as a man who is studied under the great teachers of the law. He was a Pharisee, which was also no small thing. You had to accomplish certain levels of education to become a Pharisee. He was zealous in persecuting the church, and this was before he decided that he was going to follow Christ in disseminating the gospel. At this point, he was persecuting the church and killing Christians, and as for righteousness based on the law, he was faultless. So here was a man who was faultless in his following of the Jewish law and his faith. He was the one that was pretty much responsible for the large explosive growth that took place in the New Testament. And I don't know if large and explosive would be the most accurate way to describe it, but Paul, through his ministry, established 7 churches in Asia Minor, and he was constantly writing letters to them, and thus the epistles by the Apostle Paul helped to establish the church, and we're still teaching the words of Paul today. You hear me talk about Paul's writings a lot in my messages. So as we look at the thought of sharing our faith, Paul's sharing of the good news, once he finally had this road to Damascus experience, you remember, where the blinding light comes out of heaven and he falls to the ground because he's killing Christians, believing that according to his Jewish faith, that he is doing God a good service by killing Christians, and he hears this loud voice, Saul, and his name was Saul. Saul was of Tarsus, and he said, he heard the word, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Isn't it causing you much pain to kick against the goads? And in this story, we see a conversion where Paul all of a sudden stops killing Christians and starts reproducing Christians because of this supernatural experience where the Lord spoke to him, the risen and resurrected Lord spoke to him in this encounter. And so now Paul, in Acts, the 17th chapter, Acts is a book that was written by Luke, and Luke tells a lot of the story about Paul's journeys and his evangelism. So now Paul is in Thessalonica, and he's actually reaching people there. Some Greeks accepted Paul's teaching in Thessalonica, but some of the Jews became absolutely furious at him because these were people who knew Paul, most likely. They were in Paul's circle of influence and in his sphere of influence. He probably debated with them and taught them and received teaching from them. So now all of a sudden, Paul has jumped ship. And people who are still on the ship, the Jews, the religious Jews of Paul's day, they're very angry with him. And they're saying, you've lost your mind, Paul. Paul and those accompanying him at this particular town of Thessalonica, they ended up having to run for their lives in the night because they were being threatened. And of course, if you read about Paul's journeys, his life is threatened many times from people who were trying to kill him that were from the Jewish faith. In Acts 17, the next 6 verses after the story we just looked at, Paul speaks to the Jews in Berea, and he had better results here than he did in Thessalonica. Jews and Greeks accepted the message with enthusiasm. So Paul is probably learning how to present this message and how and to have good inroads to be able to share his faith effectively. And then we look at Paul to the Greeks in Athens. This is the continuation of of Acts 17. And remember at this time that the followers of Christian faith were a small minority sharing a new, unfamiliar message among the citizens of the Roman Empire. They were new. And it was a new thing that Paul was presenting. And some people were intrigued by this new message. The Greeks in Athens worshipped many gods. People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious, Paul says. And in Acts 17:23, he says, for as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So what many people might do if we put ourselves into that situation, if we were in Athens, Greece, and we saw a lot of idols to false gods, we might not have this concept, as Paul did, to find an inroad to be able to share the message that he had received. So how did Paul approach the sharing of the good news of the message with him? Now, Paul was a very wise man, and he even made statements like, how is it that you take this big, huge piece of wood and you cut half of it off and you use it to cook and you use it to keep your homes warm, and then you fashion some idol out of the second half of it? Just the understanding of a thinking person would realize, how could this be a holy God when part of it you used also to burn, to cook things, and to keep you warm? It was lunacy in Paul's mind, but you can't tell a group of people who've embraced this ideal that it's lunacy because they're not going to listen to you. You're not going to have impact on those people's lives. So what did Paul do? What did he do to be able to share effectively the good news? He says, let me tell you about the unknown God that you worship. I notice over here there's this caption that says, to unknown gods. Well, I know this unknown God, and let me reveal to you what I know about him and share with you. And then he basically found common ground with the Greek philosophers of Athens, and he writes this to them, or he says this to them: the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and of earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. So here Paul is communicating a very positive message not condemning everything that seems wrong about them and everything that actually is wrong about these people of Athens, but instead he's elaborating on this God that they are worshiping, that they do not know really who he is. Now, the result of this was not 100% good. There were people there who embraced faith, and there were people who wanted to hear more about faith, and there were people who walked away and said, Paul, you're absolutely nuts, you're crazy. But you know something? We don't have to worry about what the response is unless the response is directly about how we are presenting and what we are presenting. We have been given a powerful message of hope, of love, and of life, and our world is desperate to know hope and love and life. And it is borderline, if not completely irresponsible of us to live with the life and the hope that we have in Christ and not be willing to figure out ways to effectively share this with people. You know what we do as church members, now that we have 4 new members for me to preach at today, you know what we do? We come to church on Sunday and feel like we've pretty much done what we need to do. And we expect people to just walk in through the doors. It's like, build it and they will come. But let me tell you, that isn't really what our job, what our role and responsibility is. And I'm not talking about going out and getting somebody and sitting them down and against their will and beating them over with the King James Bible over the head. I'm not talking about having that type of a negative impact. In fact, that's absolutely the opposite of what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this life and love of God that is living inside of us will be identified as something not human when you are surrounding yourself by people like Paul was talking to the people in Athens. We should contrast the world in our hope. We should contrast the world in our integrity. We should contrast the world in our response to people who are rude and unkind to us. But too often we just blend in. We are like everyone else, and we don't let God's powerful love live in us. And I'm not just talking to you, I'm talking to myself as well. It's not about only what happens within the 4 walls of this church, and this is very important. I feel fueled when I leave church on Sunday, a little exhausted too, but I feel energized in my spirit when I'm able to share this time with you. And my goal is that through our worship and through my words, that you will also be energized by the power of God's presence and spirit in this place when you leave. But when we leave this place, that life should continue to be our focus as we allow this living presence and power to seep through us into every situation and every conversation that we are in outside these 4 walls. Find common ground with the people that you come in contact with and always affirm them. Never try to correct what's wrong about them. That doesn't work. Have you noticed? It doesn't work with us, and it doesn't work with anyone. So he continues to say, from one man, Paul is talking to the people of Athens. He's saying, from one man, God made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. Think about that statement for a moment. God is not far from anyone. That means the person who believes anything other than God, the most devout atheist on the planet that doesn't believe anything about God and this life beyond, it says that God is not far from that person. God is never far from any of us. But God did all that he did related to the human earth, to us as human beings on the earth, placing the time that we would be born and the boundaries of the countries. And God did this all so that we would seek him and, who knows, perhaps even reach out to God and find him, though he is not far. For in him we live and move. It's in him that we have our being. And then he even quotes some of the prophets or the poets of Athens when he says, even your own poets have said, we are God's offspring. What is Paul doing? He's finding common ground with people who don't believe in the God that he serves, who don't believe in Jesus as Messiah. They probably had never even heard the story or only heard rumorings of it. But now they have a live testimony of the truth of Jesus' life and the impact that it had in that day. And what is he doing? He's quoting the poets of Athens for an inroad to be able to share the truth of the gospel. We need not be afraid of that, because I'll tell you, when our words come out of our mouths, which is only part of it, because love should be emanating from our hearts as well, and care and concern should be coming from our emotions and our minds. This is all a part of it, but when this is happening, it's not just up to us to convince somebody. The very real presence of God that surrounds us, because God is not far from anyone, is there to bring life to the words that we speak and to the hands that we reach out to these people and to all people. And then in that moment and in that time, there's a spiritual thing happening inside of us that we cannot even measure. You cannot even see it. My focus in this message today is that we might be more aware that we are living in a world that is very different than has ever been. I'm grateful that I don't feel picked on as much because of sexual identity as Christians once did in the world. I am grateful that we have a more open society that isn't judging and condemning everyone for all sorts of reasons, that there is this human rights issue that comes to bear regardless of race or sexual identity or nationality, regardless of whether you're female or male. None of those things really matter, and we even read in Scripture that that is the case. Is the good of the message of God flowing out of us, especially when we're with people who don't believe what we believe? That's the question I'm asking today. 1 Peter, in conclusion. Peter gives us instruction. Paul gave us an example that we viewed in Acts 17 of how he maneuvered through idolatry to preach a relevant message to people who needed to hear from God. And Peter also gives us instruction on how to live among non-Christian people. He says to live honorably among unbelievers. Today they defame you, and there are some that do, as if you were doing evil because of the way you believe and the way you live. But in the day when God visits to judge, they will glorify him. I don't want you to skip by that sentence that I just read. But in the day when God visits to judge, those unbelievers, will glorify God because they have observed your honorable deeds. Is that new? A new thought maybe to some of us this morning? God is coming to judge the world. I think all Christians believe that. And a lot of other people probably do too as well. But when he comes, you know what Christians think that's going to happen and what we tell other people who are non-Christians going to happen? God's going to fry you. Talk about fried Twinkies. It's going to be fried non-believers. That's what we're always saying, which could include some fried Twinkies. Get it, Twinks? Okay. The point is, we are like, yes, God, get them. Fry them. Get those people who have been hard on me. Which couldn't be further from what God is wanting to do and communicate. The day that God arrives finally on this planet, and we'll all be there, we'll all be observing it, he's going to be here to judge, and those who were non-believers are going to glorify God because they have observed your honorable deeds. Do you realize that your honorable deeds may be the very thing that a non-believer hinges on in coming to faith in God? We see in this scripture, if you take it for face value, that when God comes to judge the world, there's still going to be unbelievers who turn and glorify him. Who are we to say who God's going to fry like a Twinkie? I have my questions about God frying anyone, quite honestly. I'm not so sure I believe that at all. That's just my 2 cents worth. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Oh my gosh, where did he get the next line? Respect the government? Are you nuts? Christians don't very often respect the government, do we? I have my own list of complaints about the government. But treat everyone you meet with dignity. We can agree with that, and it's a challenge, isn't it? Sometimes it's difficult to treat people with dignity. Love your spiritual family. You know who that is? That's me. That's you. Let's love each other. Sometimes it's hard for you to love me, isn't it? I don't hear amens, but I know it's happening in here. Sometimes you're a little hard to love. We're all difficult to love at times. But love your spiritual family. What relationship doesn't have its ups and downs? Except for Eric, of course, he's perfect. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Revere God. And oh, by the way, respect the government. Do we believe that God has put into place governments in our world? Are they perfect? No. But do you realize that there's coming a day when the government is going to rest upon the shoulders of Christ, and then only will it really be fully functional as God intended it to be. Until then, we're working with a broken system, and that's just the way it is. But we are not given the right to do anything less than respect even the government, which is just a sideline. 1 Peter goes on to say, be compassionate and be humble. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. God opposes the proud, but he shows favor to the humble. In the song that we sang this morning, and I'm going to go back to that song, Lance, All the Heavens. We're going to go back to sing that, and not immediately, but in a few minutes. It says, let your face shine on us, and all the world will know that you live. Do you know why the world doesn't know that God is alive today? Because there is no evidence in the face of a lot of people who are wearing the label. This series is about let's not just check the label, friends. Let's be who we're supposed to be. Let's let God's face shine upon us so that everyone will know that he is alive and well. It is through us becoming the mirror to a reflection, I should say, to where people view God in us. This is what will change lives. And you know the first life it will change? Mine. Yours. It will change us before it ever changes someone else. But in that change, you're going to begin to see differences in people's lives. I'm going to ask the band to come back. And let's go back.